The station was called the Concorde Ring. It floated in space like a giant wheel made of metal and light, slowly turning above a quiet yellow star that belonged to no one. 312 species had agreed to that. The star belonged to no one. It was neutral ground. The Concorde Ring was neutral ground. That was the rule, and for 400 years, every species in the known galaxy had followed it. The ring was enormous. Its outer halls were wide enough to fit creatures the size of buildings. Its inner chambers were pressurized differently for different species. Some sections were filled with methane, some with thick, wet air, some with cold so sharp it would kill a human in seconds. The ring had been built with great care, so that every species could walk its halls and breathe and exist without suffering. Humanity had only been given access to the ring 3 years ago. It had taken them longer than most to reach the stars. Some species had been traveling between solar systems for thousands of years before the first human boot ever touched the moon. But humans had gotten there eventually, moving fast once they started, building ships and stations and colonies with a kind of focused energy that a few of the older species found quietly unsettling, though none of them said so out loud. When humanity joined the Galactic Concorde, they were welcomed, politely, the way you welcome someone at a party when you are not sure yet if you like them. They were given a small section of the ring, a medium-sized chamber with standard atmospheric conditions, and a seat at the outer edge of the Grand Assembly floor, far from the center podium. It was a symbolic position. It meant, you are here, but you are not important yet. Ambassador Ilara Voss did not mind the outer edge. She had sat in worse places. She was a tall woman, lean and straight-backed, now with dark eyes that had a habit of going very still when she was thinking hard. She had spent 20 years in Earth's diplomatic service before being chosen for the Concorde posting. She spoke 6 human languages and had learned 2 alien ones. She was patient, careful, and very good at reading a room. She sat in the human delegation section on the morning the Vorkai arrived. The Vorkai entered the Grand Assembly the way they entered every room, like they owned it. There were 12 of them in the official delegation, though the word delegation felt wrong for a group that moved less like diplomats and more like a predator pack. They were large. Each one stood over 3 meters tall on 6 of their 8 limbs, using the back 4 to walk and the front 4 as arms and hands. Their skin was the color of dark stone, rough and ridged, almost armored-looking. Their eyes were golden and wide-set, thus designed by millions of years of evolution to track moving prey across great distances. The Vorkai had conquered 41 star systems, not colonized, conquered. There was a difference, and everyone in the Galactic Concorde understood it. The species that had once lived freely in those 41 systems now lived under Vorkai law, paid Vorkai taxes, and spoke carefully when Vorkai officials were nearby. Some of them still had seats in the Conquered Assembly. They voted in ways that never upset their conquerors. Everyone knew this. No one said it out loud because the Vorkai were also the most physically powerful species anyone had ever encountered. Their military had not lost a war in 600 years. Their ships were fast and heavily armed. Their ground soldiers were, biologically speaking, close to unstoppable. They healed quickly. They felt less pain than most species. To break things. The lead Vorkai delegate to break things. The lead Vorkai delegate was named Vraxon. He was older than the others, which showed in the deeper ridges across his hide and the faint silver at the edges of his wide mouth. And he had been the Vorkai's primary Concorde representative for 30 years and wore his authority the way some creatures wear their coloring, naturally without effort, as though it had always been part of him. He took his seat at the center of the assembly floor. The Vorkai always sat at the center. The session began. There were matters of trade route adjustments, a border disagreement between 2 small species near the outer spiral, a request by the Thelic Commonwealth for additional medical technology sharing. Ilara listened to all of it. She took notes. She was there to learn how the Concorde operated, and she was learning. Humanity was new here. She was careful not to speak too much or push too hard too soon. Then the session reached new member address, which was a tradition. New member species were given the floor to speak to the full assembly and introduce themselves formally. Humanity had joined 3 years ago, but the session addressing their membership had been delayed twice due to scheduling issues. This was the day it had finally been arranged. Elara stood and walked to the speaker's platform at the center of the room. She had prepared remarks. They were good remarks, honest and direct, explaining who humans were, what they valued, what they hoped to contribute to the conquered. She had practiced them until she could say them in her sleep. She was 2 sentences in when Vraxon interrupted. "Not address one," he said. "In the common Concord address," he said in the common Concord tongue that all species used in this chamber. "The Vorkai delegation has a point of order." Elara stopped. She looked at him. Every eye in the room, and there were hundreds of different kinds of eyes turned toward the Vorkai. Vraxon stood. He was much taller than the speaker's platform was designed for, so he stood beside it rather than at it, looking down at the room the way something standing on a hill looks down at a valley. "We wish to address the matter of humanity's presence in this assembly," he said. The room was quiet, not comfortable quiet, the kind of quiet where everyone is waiting to see what happens next and hoping it does not involve them. "Humanity," Vraxon continued, "is a young species, newly arrived, short-lived by any meaningful measure, physically unremarkable. Their home system has a single inhabited world. Their colonial reach is limited. Their military capacity is, at this point in their development, modest at best." He paused, turning his golden eyes slowly across the room, as though making sure everyone was listening. "The Vorkai do not dispute humanity's right to exist. What we dispute is the appropriateness of granting such a species a formal seat in this assembly at this time." There was a soft murmur through the chamber, not protest. So it's more like nervous shifting. Elara stood very still at the speaker's platform. Her face had not changed. Vraxon continued. "The Concord Assembly is a body of consequence. The decisions made here affect civilizations that span hundreds of worlds, trillions of lives, economies and systems that have functioned for centuries. Granting a voting seat to a species that has barely left its own solar system, that has no meaningful history in galactic affairs, that has not proven its strength or its stability, this cheapens the assembly." He looked directly at Elara now. "No offense is intended to the human delegation. This is simply fact. Prey does not sit at the same table as those who have earned their place here. Prey," he had said it clearly, in the common tongue, in front of every delegation in the assembly. "Prey," as though humanity were something to be hunted rather than recognized. As though Elara were standing at that podium not as an ambassador, but as something that had wandered in from outside and hadn't yet been dealt with. Several delegations looked away. Some studied their notes. A few of the smaller species in the outer sections had gone very still. Vraxon then did something that no one in the assembly had expected, because even for the Vorkai, it was extreme. He reached across the space beside him and picked up the human delegation's communications terminal. I picked it up in one large hand and crushed it to pieces. He was a piece of standard equipment, fixed to the delegate bench, used to send messages, record votes, communicate with home. He picked it up in one large hand and crushed it. The metal crumpled. The screen shattered. He set the broken pieces back down on the bench. "Prey," he said again, almost thoughtfully, "does not negotiate." He sat back down. The assembly was completely silent. Elara Voss looked at the destroyed terminal. She looked at the pieces. Then she looked up at Vraxon, and she looked at him for a long moment with those very still dark eyes. There was no fear in them. There was no rage either, which somehow made it worse. There was something quieter and more serious than rage. She straightened her jacket. She put both hands flat on the surface of the speaker's platform. "I would like to thank the Vorkai delegation," she said in perfect common tongue, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber without any raised volume. For making this moment so easy to remember." She let that sit for a second. "My prepared remarks no longer seem necessary. I think the Assembly has just learned everything it needs to know about who we are and what we stand for by watching how we respond to what just happened." She lifted her eyes from Vraxon and looked slowly around the room, meeting the eyes of delegation after delegation. "To every species watching, we see you. We see how many of you said nothing just now, and then we understand why. We are not angry at you for it. We know what the Vorkai are. We know what silence costs." She paused. "But I want to be very clear about something. And I want every translation system in this chamber running at full accuracy when I say it." The room was absolutely still. "What just happened," she said, "was the last mistake the Vorkai will ever make with impunity." She stepped away from the platform. She walked back to the human delegation section and sat down in her seat and began writing a message home. Vraxon watched her go, his mouth curved into something that, on a Vorkai face, passed for amusement. Around the chamber, other species watched her sit down. Some of them were watching with pity. A few of the older species, the ones who had been in the Concord long enough to have seen many things, watched with something different. Not pity, something more like recognition. The message Ilara sent home was classified, but its contents became known within 24 hours, as these things always do when the information is important enough. It was a full report of the session with a recommendation. The recommendation was 3 words long: prepare for war. On Earth, the message arrived on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, it had reached every head of government on the planet. By Wednesday, it had reached the commanders of every human military fleet. By Thursday, the Joint Command War Council had its first emergency session. No one who attended that session would later describe it as long or complicated. There were no long debates. There were no factions arguing for caution. The recording of the assembly session had been attached to Ilara's message. Every person in that council room watched Vraxon crush the terminal. Every person heard him say pray. The vote was unanimous. It was, as one historian would later note with some amazement, so the first unanimous vote in recorded human political history on a matter of global importance. Humans had been fighting amongst themselves for as long as there had been humans. They disagreed on everything: taxes, borders, food, religion, the right way to queue for things. They had never, in all their long and complicated history, agreed on anything without at least one person raising an objection. They agreed on this. Word spread through human space quickly. The colonies heard it, and the deep space stations heard it. Mining crews on the edge of the solar system heard it, and the response from ordinary humans, from people who had never held a weapon or thought much about galactic politics, was not panic. It was not hysteria. It was something that would be very difficult to explain to a species that had never experienced it. A kind of collective settling, a stillness. The way a person who has been very patient for a very long time finally stands up, rolls up their sleeves, and gets to work. On the Concord Ring, in the days after the assembly session, the alien delegations spoke quietly among themselves. The Vorkai delegation had already returned to their section and showed no particular interest in what the smaller species were saying. They never did. A small gray diplomat from the Meath Collective found himself standing near the corridor that led to the human section, watching Ilara Voss walk past with 2 of her staff. When he had served in the Concord for 60 years, he had seen many things. He had watched species disappear and species rise. He had watched the Vorkai do exactly what they had done in that session to 4 other species over the years, and all 4 of those species had quietly reduced their presence in the assembly and moved to the outer edges of galactic politics, out of the Vorkai's line of sight. He had expected humanity to do the same. What he had not expected was the look on Ilara Voss's face as she walked past him. She was not afraid. She was not even particularly angry anymore. She was making lists. He could tell somehow, just by watching her move. She was a person whose mind was already several steps ahead, already working through what came next, already building something. He had a feeling, deep in his old gut, that what came next was going to be very significant. He thought about the Vorkai, sitting comfortable in their central section, laughing about prey. He thought about the old Earth war records he had once reviewed out of academic curiosity years ago. The long, exhausting, brutal history of a species that had spent thousands of years doing nothing but fighting itself and learning from every single defeat and getting back up every single time. He went back to his section and sent a private message to his government. "I believe," the message said, "that the Vorkai have made an error. I cannot fully explain why I believe this, but I recommend we watch humanity very carefully over the coming months, and I further recommend that we do not position ourselves against them." He sent the message and sat quietly for a while, watching the stars outside his window. The Concord Ring turned slowly in the light of the neutral star. Somewhere on the other side of the galaxy, in the deep military yards above Earth's moon, the lights were on all night. When Alara Voss stood at the window of her quarters on the ring and looked at the stars for a long time that night, her staff had gone to sleep. The station was quiet. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint hum of the ring's rotation engines, steady and constant. The heartbeat of this strange place that was supposed to be neutral ground for everyone. She thought about what Vraxon had said. Not because it had hurt her, though there was something in it that burned, if she was honest. She thought about it because it was useful. Not the insult itself, but what the insult revealed. The Vorkai had been at the top for so long that they had completely forgotten what it felt like to be underestimated. They had never had to remember. She picked up her personal communicator and pulled up a file she had been building for 2 years. Notes and observations and assessments. Everything she had learned about the Vorkai since being posted to the ring. Their military doctrine. Long each conquest had taken. She read long each conquest had taken. She read through it for an hour. Then she wrote one line at the bottom and saved the file. The line read, "They have never fought anyone who was not afraid of them." She closed the file. She went to bed. In the morning, there was a war to start preparing for. And the first thing the galaxy noticed was the silence. After the assembly session, after Alara Voss walked back to her seat and sent her message home, the other species in the Concord had expected something. A formal complaint, maybe. A request for an emergency session. Perhaps a tearful appeal to the Assembly's Ethics Committee, which existed on paper but had never once held the Vorkai accountable for anything. What they got was silence. The human delegation continued attending sessions. Oh, they voted on matters they cared about. They filed their reports. They ate their meals in the ring's common areas. They were polite to everyone they passed in the corridors. Ambassador Voss was seen in the ring's small library most evenings reading. She slept regular hours. She did not appear distressed. This confused many delegations more than anger would have. The Vorkai found it mildly amusing. "Prey learns to stay quiet," one of Vraxon's junior delegates said, in what he thought was a private conversation, but which 3 different listening systems recorded. "They know their place now." Vraxon said nothing to that. He was not as sure as his junior delegate. He had lived long enough to know that silence was not always surrender. Sometimes silence was preparation. But humanity was small and new and far from home, and he had seen dozens of species fold after a fraction of the pressure he had applied in that session. He put the humans to the back of his mind and moved on to more important matters. He would regret that. On Earth, in a large building in the mountains of what used to be called Switzerland, the Joint Command War Council was meeting for the 4th time in 10 days. The room was not impressive from the outside. Inside, it was a serious place. Long table, direct lighting, no decorations, no windows. The people who sat around that table were not politicians in the traditional sense. And they were the senior commanders of every human military branch, the heads of the 4 largest colonial defense fleets, and 2 civilian advisors whose job was to make sure the military people did not forget that wars cost money and lives in equal measure. General Adisa Okafor sat at the head of the table. He was a large, quiet man with close-cropped gray hair and hands that looked like they had been carved from something hard. He had commanded Earth's combined space fleet for 6 years. Before that, he had commanded a colonial defense force through a conflict with a hostile alien species that no one in the wider galaxy considered particularly serious. He considered it serious. It had taught him things. The briefing that morning was about numbers. Fleet Admiral Chen Zhao presented them. She was younger than Okafor, sharper in her movements, the kind of person who thought 3 problems ahead of the current one and found it hard to be patient while everyone else caught up. "To the current human military capacity," she said, pulling up the display, "is strong by any reasonable measure for a species our age and size. We have 412 active warships across all classes, 18 fully operational combat stations, ground forces numbering approximately 40 million trained personnel across Earth and colonies, weapon systems current to the last 8 years of development." She paused. "The Vorkai have 6,000 warships, 39 combat stations, and ground forces estimated at 200 million, though some analysts think that number's low. Their technology is, in most categories, older than ours but proven and reliable. They have been at war in one form or another continuously for 600 years. She let those numbers sit in the room for a moment. So on paper, she said, we are outmatched. General Okafor looked at the display. On paper, he agreed. Tell me what the paper doesn't say. Chen Zhao almost smiled. This was why she had always respected Okafor. He asked the right questions. The paper doesn't say, she continued, clicking to the next display, that the Vorkai have never fought a war of attrition. Every conflict they have won, and they have won all of them, ended within 2 years, usually much faster. They win by overwhelming force in the opening phase. They move fast, hit hard, win and break the enemy's ability to resist before the enemy has time to adapt. She pointed to a timeline of Vorkai military history, a long line of short, decisive conflicts. This is what they know. This is the only way they have ever fought. And we, Okafor said. She clicked to a new display. It was a different timeline, much longer, much messier. It was human military history, not the clean version that people sometimes remembered, the heroic highlights and the famous victories. The full version, the long, ugly, complicated, grinding truth of how humanity had spent the last 10,000 years dealing with conflict. Wars that lasted decades, wars that swallowed generations, wars where one side lost almost everything and somehow, stubbornly, impossibly, kept fighting. Wars where the losing side rebuilt faster than the winning side expected and came back stronger. Okafor looked at it for a long time. We've been training for this our whole existence, he said quietly, and we just didn't know who the opponent was going to be. The analysts who were assigned to study the Vorkai's intelligence files on humanity had a strange few weeks. The Vorkai had collected information on humanity, as they did on all species, but it was thin. Brief notes on population, technology level, political structure, military size. The kind of surface assessment you make when something is not yet worth your serious attention. But the human side had something the Vorkai did not. Earth's historical archives. Thousands of years of wars, strategies, failures, adaptations, recoveries, and hard lessons. It was all there, open and available, because humans had always believed in recording what happened so it could be studied and learned from. A young intelligence analyst named Rory Vasquez spent 3 weeks doing nothing but reading those archives and writing summaries. She was 26 years old and had never been in combat, but she was very good at patterns. And the patterns she found in the human military record was so clear and consistent that she wrote it up in a report and marked it urgent. The report was titled, Why Humanity Gets Harder. The Longer You Fight It. The central argument was simple. Humanity across all its history showed a consistent pattern that no other species they had encountered shared. When threatened, humans did not slow down. One, they sped up. When resources were limited, they innovated. When their technology was outmatched, they adapted tactics. When they lost soldiers, more volunteered. When their cities were bombed, they built factories in the rubble. She cited the Second World War specifically, a conflict, she wrote, in which one side bombed the other's capital city repeatedly for months, and the result was not surrender. The result was increased production, increased enlistment, and in a civilian population that became more determined, not less. The bombing had been intended to break morale. Instead, it had forged it into something harder. She cited the way human wars had always forced advancement. Every major conflict in human history had produced breakthroughs. In medicine, in engineering, in communication, in logistics. As though war for humanity was not just destruction, but also a terrible kind of crucible that burned off weakness and left something stronger behind. She ended the report with a line that her superior read 3 times before passing it up the chain. Every species we have encountered treats war as an interruption to normal life. For humanity, historically, war has been a driver of normal life. We do not slow down during conflict, we accelerate. The Vorkai are about to discover this, and they will not be ready for it. The report reached General Okafor's desk on a Friday. He read it once, folded his hands on the table, and sat very still for a while. Then he picked up his communicator and called Admiral Chen Zhao. Start the production acceleration, he said. All categories. Full schedule. Already started, she said. 2 days ago. While Earth was preparing, the colonies were preparing too. There were 42 human colony worlds spread across a wide stretch of space, ranging from fully developed planets with billions of people to small, rough frontier settlements with a few 100,000. As they were very different from each other in almost every way: climate, culture, economy, personality. Colonies had a habit of developing strong identities quickly, separate from Earth's, and most of the colony worlds had at least some level of tension with the central government about one thing or another. When the message about the assembly session went out, all of that stopped. The colony of New Carthage, a dry, sandy world that had been arguing with Earth about trade tariffs for 11 years, sent a message within 6 hours of receiving the news: tariff dispute suspended. We are with you. What do you need? The colony of Jericho Station, a massive orbital habitat that had been pushing for full political independence for 3 years, sent a message within 12 hours. Independence referendum postponed. Send us a weapons shipment and tell us where to point them. One, the deep space mining colony of Halo Point, which was so far out on the edge of charted human space that communication took 4 hours at light speed, sent a message that arrived 2 days after the news and said simply, "We heard. We're in. All 40,000 of us." One by one, every human settlement in space said the same thing in different words. The historians would later spend a lot of time trying to explain why. Why had a species that could not agree on tax policy or border laws or the right temperature to brew a hot drink suddenly spoken with one voice the moment a Vorkai delegate crushed a communications terminal and called them prey? The best answer anyone came up with was this: humans had a deep, old, complicated relationship with the idea of being looked down on. They had spent enough of their own history in systems where some people were told they were worth less than others, where some voices were silenced and some people were treated as less than fully real. That history was painful and unresolved in many ways, but it had also left something behind: a collective sensitivity, almost instinctive, to the specific feeling of being dismissed, of being told, "You do not count, you are not worth considering, you are prey." Something in humanity, some very old and very deep part of it, responded to that with a single unified answer: no. The Vorkai's senior intelligence officer was a lean, careful creature named Sketh Var. She was not like most Vorkai, not loud, not physically imposing by her species standards, not interested in displaying dominance. She was interested in information, in accuracy, in the quiet work of understanding opponents before they became problems. She had filed a report about humanity 8 months before the assembly session, when she first noticed them starting to show up on the galactic stage. The report had said that humanity was worth monitoring, not because they were strong, because they were unusual. They have a history, her report had read, that suggests they process adversity differently than other species we have encountered. Further study recommended. No one had acted on the report. Humanity had seemed too small to matter. Now, Skethvar was in a small room on the Vorkai's primary military station, surrounded by data, and she was very quietly, very carefully, trying to build a complete picture of what humanity actually was. The picture was making her uncomfortable. She had been pulling Earth's open historical archives, the ones available in the Concord's public database, and reading them in careful detail. Military history mostly, but also economic history, population history, conflict recovery rates. She had built charts and timelines and comparison models. The charts were not reassuring. She pulled up one particular data set: time to military production increase after declaration of war, measured across all species in the Concord's historical records. For most species, the response curve climbed slowly. They needed months, sometimes years, to begin significantly increasing weapons production. Supply chains had to be reorganized. Factories had to be retooled. Political will had to be built and maintained. For humanity, the historical curve was almost vertical. She checked it 3 times because she thought she had made a calculation error. She had not. Twice in human history, in the conflict they called the Second World War, a single nation had, within 18 months of entering the conflict, increased its military production output by over 1,000%. 1,000%. She had never seen a number like that in any other species' records. She closed that file and opened another one about human ground combat. She read it for 2 hours. And then she did something she rarely did. She closed all her files and sat in the quiet room and just thought. Vorkai ground soldiers were biologically extraordinary, stronger than almost any species, faster than most, highly resistant to physical damage, trained from adolescence in combat. She had reviewed footage of Vorkai ground forces in action in past conflicts, and it was, even to her analytical eye, genuinely impressive. She pulled up footage of human ground forces in training exercises. Humans were biologically unimpressive, soft compared to Vorkai. They broke easily. Bones fractured, skin tore. Organs were vulnerable in dozens of ways. They felt a great deal of pain. They tired. They were smaller and weaker in almost every direct physical comparison. But they were also, and this was the part that kept pulling at Skethvar's attention, extraordinarily adaptable. She watched human training footage and saw soldiers practicing in desert heat, in frozen mountain conditions, us in underwater environments, in zero gravity, in dense urban environments, in open plains. They trained for every condition because, in their history, they had fought in every condition. She watched footage of human soldiers drilling in tunnel systems, close quarters, tight spaces, the kind of environment where size was a disadvantage. She thought about Vorkai soldiers, 3 meters tall, 8 limbs, built for open field dominance. She thought about tunnel fighting. She opened a new document and started writing. At the top she wrote, urgent assessment, humanity conflict risk. Then she started filling in what she knew and what she suspected and what she was afraid of. She wrote for 4 hours. At the end, she flagged the document for high command review and sent it through the secure channel with a priority marker she had only used twice in her career. Then she sat back and hoped someone would read it in time. In her experience, they usually didn't. On her 2 months after the assembly session, the Vorkai received humanity's formal declaration of war. It arrived through official Concord channels, properly formatted, following every diplomatic protocol exactly. It was calm, clear, and precise. It listed the specific acts, the deliberate humiliation of the human delegation, the destruction of official property, were the use of language designed to deny humanity's standing as a recognized species, and it stated that humanity considered these acts sufficient grounds for formal military conflict. It was signed by Ambassador Ilara Voss on behalf of Earth and all human colonies, and countersigned by every human colony governor in alphabetical order. The list of signatures was very long. Vraxon read it at his desk on the Concord ring. He read it twice. And then he set it down and looked at his reflection in the dark surface of his desk for a moment. He thought about Ilara Voss walking back to her seat in the assembly, not angry, not afraid, already making lists. He thought about Skethvar's urgent report, which he had received 2 days ago and read with a feeling he did not want to name. He thought about 600 years of unbroken victories. He thought about species that had looked small and manageable, and then surprised him. And he thought, they cannot possibly be a serious threat. They are too new, too small, too few. The numbers are impossible. But numbers, he was old enough to know, were not always the whole story. He picked up the declaration and sent a response. The response accepted the terms. It was brief, as Vorkai military responses always were. It said, essentially, we accept. Come and find out what war really means. Across human space, the response arrived at every fleet, every colony, every station. I write in supply chains to organize and write in supply chains to organize, and weapons to design and test and build and test again. Humanity had been preparing for 2 months already. They would keep preparing. And the thing that the Vorkai did not understand yet, the thing that Skethvar had understood and put in her report and desperately hoped someone would take seriously, was that humanity's preparation did not slow down after the declaration. It got faster, because the declaration made it real. And when things were real, humanity moved. The lights in the shipyards above Earth's moon had not gone off in 63 days. They would not go off for a very long time. The Cathara corridor was not a pretty part of space. It was a long, dense stretch of asteroid belt sitting between 2 unremarkable star systems at the edge of Vorkai territory. The rocks were big and close together, tumbling slowly in the dark, some of them the size of small moons, most of them just large enough to hide a ship behind if the pilot was careful. The corridor was about 4 light hours wide at its narrowest point and 11 at its widest. It was not a place most species chose to travel through. Navigation was slow and careful work in the corridor. Sensors got confused by the density of the rock field. Signals bounced oddly. It was the kind of place where things could disappear. The Vorkai used it as a supply route, had done for 200 years. 3 major resupply lines ran through the corridor, feeding their military stations on the outer edge of their territory. It was efficient, well-established, and, until recently, completely unchallenged. This was the first place humanity chose to make itself known. Fleet Commander Yara Solis received her orders 6 weeks after the declaration of war. She was given command of a task force, not a large one by any traditional measure of fleet warfare. 14 ships, a mix of fast destroyers, 2 medium cruisers, out in a handful of specialized vessels that did not fit neatly into any standard category because they had been designed for a specific purpose in the last 8 weeks of frantic production back home. Her orders did not say, go to the Cathara corridor and fight the Vorkai fleet. That would have been straightforward and also suicidal given the numbers. Her orders said something more interesting. They said, go to the Cathara corridor and make it unusable. She read those orders 3 times on the bridge of her ship, the HCVS Relentless, with a slight smile that her crew had learned to recognize. It was the smile that meant she had already figured out how to do something before the briefing was over. All right, she said, folding the orders. Let's go break something important. The Vorkai fleet commanders in that sector were not worried when their long-range scouts reported a small human task force entering the outer edge of the Cathara corridor. It 14 ships. The Vorkai had 93 warships operating in and around the corridor and the systems on either side of it. The math was simple. The human commander, whoever they were, was either very brave or very foolish, and in the Vorkai's experience, those 2 things were usually the same thing. They sent a response force, 20 ships, because 20 was more than enough, and because sending more would have been embarrassing, like stepping on an insect with both feet. The response force moved to intercept. The humans ran, not in a panicked way. They moved fast and they moved into the deepest, densest part of the asteroid field, where the rocks were packed tightest and navigation required full attention. The Vorkai response force followed. They were bigger ships generally. The Vorkai built large, and navigating the dense rock field required them to slow down and spread out. Because 2 of their ships had already taken minor hull damage from asteroid contact at higher speeds. They followed the humans for 6 hours through the rock field. They did not catch them. What they found instead, over those 6 hours, was that the asteroids around them were slowly becoming different from the asteroids they had entered with. The humans had been through here before, weeks before probably. Quiet scout ships that had come through without announcing themselves, doing slow, careful work in the dark. The asteroids had been seeded, mines, not the crude explosive type that most species used. These were smarter, small devices attached to the rock surfaces, nearly invisible to standard sensors because they had been designed to mimic the electromagnetic signature of the surrounding stone. They did not explode randomly. They were networked. They waited. When the Vorkai response force was deep enough into the field, spread out enough, moving carefully enough that a fast exit was difficult, they activated. Not all at once. That would have been wasteful. They activated in sequence, targeting propulsion systems, targeting sensor arrays, targeting communications equipment. The humans had studied Vorkai ship design carefully enough to know exactly where those systems were housed, and they had positioned the devices accordingly. In 4 minutes, 9 of the 20 Vorkai ships were crippled, not destroyed, crippled. 2 unable to move quickly, or unable to see clearly, or unable to communicate with each other. The remaining 11 pulled back immediately, dragging their damaged companions, taking 3 more minor hits from devices that activated during the retreat. The human task force was already gone, out the other side of the corridor, moving fast, leaving nothing behind but the mines and the mess. The resupply route through the Cathara corridor was shut down for 11 weeks while the Vorkai swept it for devices. They found most of them. They were not sure they found all of them. For the first time in 200 years, the supply lines through the corridor moved at a fraction of their normal speed, because every ship that went through moved slowly and carefully, checking everything. Fleet Commander Solis received a brief and warm message from General Okafor when she returned to the staging base. It said, "Good work. Rest your crew for 48 hours. Then do it again somewhere else." She was already looking at maps. The thing that the Vorkai High Command found most frustrating in the first 4 months of the conflict was not the damage. The damage was real. The corridor operation, 3 subsequent attacks on relay stations, the destruction of a fuel depot on the outer edge of Sector 9. But individually, none of these actions were catastrophic. They were annoying. They were expensive to repair and replace. But none of them were the kind of strike that ended a war. The frustration was that humanity was not behaving the way opponents were supposed to behave. Every species the Vorkai had ever fought had followed a recognizable pattern. The conflict had a shape. There was an opening phase where both sides assessed each other. Then there was a main engagement where fleets met and the stronger fleet won. Then there was a pursuit phase, and then there was a surrender. The shape was almost always the same because the Vorkai had engineered it to be that way. They moved so fast and hit so hard in the opening phase that the main engagement happened before the opponent had fully prepared, and the result was a foregone conclusion. Humanity was refusing to reach the main engagement. Every time the Vorkai massed their fleet for a significant strike, the humans were somewhere else, doing something unexpected to a target the Vorkai had not prioritized. They hit communication relays, which forced the Vorkai to reroute signals, which slowed response times. They hit fuel depots, which forced supply ships to travel longer routes, which stretched logistics. They planted mines in shipping lanes, which forced slower, more careful movement across entire sectors. They attacked nothing that seemed vital but damaged everything that kept the Vorkai machine running smoothly. They are not trying to win battles, Fleet Admiral Vrak Don, younger brother of Vrak San, and the operational commander of the war effort, said in a high command session 6 months in. They are trying to slow us down. Then we should move faster, one of his commanders said. We cannot move faster, another said, because they have mined half the fast routes. The room was quiet in the uncomfortable way that rooms get quiet when the problem being discussed does not have a clean answer. Skethvar was in that room. She had been brought in because her pre-war assessment of humanity had turned out to be more accurate than anyone had wanted to admit. She did not say, "I told you so," because she was professional and because saying it would not help anything. But she did say what she had come to say. "Why, they are not trying to slow us down," she said, when the room had been quiet long enough. "They are trying to change the shape of the war." Frakdon looked at her. "Explain." "The Vorkai way of war has a shape," she said. "Fast opening, decisive engagement, quick surrender. We have fought this way for 600 years because it works. Every species we have fought has been forced into that shape because we moved before they could prepare." She pulled up a display. "So humanity is refusing the shape. They are not preparing for the engagement we want to have. They are building toward the engagement they want to have. And they are using this time. Every week we spend chasing them through asteroid fields and sweeping mines from shipping lanes. They are using this time to produce more ships, train more soldiers, and learn more about how we fight." "You are saying they are getting stronger while we chase them," Frakdon said. "Yes," Skethvar said. "Inna, that is exactly what I am saying." Frakdon was silent for a moment. "Then we stop chasing them. We take one of their colony worlds instead. Force them to defend." Skethvar said nothing. She had thoughts about that, but she had already said enough unpopular things for one session. The colony world of Oran's Gate was the closest human settlement to the Vorkai border. A mid-sized colony of about 400 million people sitting on a cold, green world with mountains that ran across its equator like a spine. It had been a colony for 80 years. It had its own government, its own culture, its own quiet identity. The people of Oran's Gate were tough in the way that people who live on cold worlds tend to be tough. Not aggressive, but solid. Hard to move. When the Vorkai fleet came for it, 60 warships, a force large enough to crack any resistance. They expected to find a colony world trying desperately to evacuate or surrender. What they found was a colony world that had been preparing for them for 5 months. The evacuation of non-combatants had happened in the first weeks after the declaration of war. Children, the elderly, people with no combat role, They had been moved out quietly and efficiently, sent to deeper colony worlds and Earth itself. What remained on Orin's Gate was essentially a military installation that had chosen to look like a colony. The mountains were fortified. The tunnel systems that ran through the mountain ranges, built originally for mining, had been expanded and reinforced and armed. Every pass and approach had been covered. The orbital defense platforms, which most colony worlds had in modest numbers, had been quietly tripled in the months since the declaration. The Vorkai fleet hit the orbital platforms first. The platforms fought hard, and most of them were destroyed, but not before they had done serious damage to 3 Vorkai capital ships and destroyed 11 smaller ones. The Vorkai landed ground forces expecting resistance from a scared civilian population, backed by a thin line of soldiers. They landed into the ground forces of 4 full human combat divisions that had been waiting for them in the mountains. The fighting that followed was not clean or quick. The Vorkai ground soldiers were everything their reputation said they were: powerful, fast, nearly unstoppable in open ground. In the mountain passes, in the tunnels, in the close rocky terrain between the peaks, that power became harder to use. Vorkai soldiers were large. The tunnels were human-sized. They had to break apart into smaller groups to pursue, and smaller groups of Vorkai, in confined spaces, against human soldiers who had trained for exactly this environment for months. Hai were far less invincible than they appeared in open terrain. The fighting went on for 3 weeks. The Vorkai took the lowlands and the coastal settlements. They never took the mountains. Every push into the high terrain was met with ambushes, with traps, with human soldiers who fell back and drew them in deeper, and then hit them from 3 directions at once. The Vorkai commanders kept expecting the defense to crack. It did not crack. At the end of 3 weeks, the Vorkai forces on Orin's Gate had taken losses that none of their commanders had anticipated, and none of them reported accurately back to Vrakdan because the numbers were embarrassing. One Vorkai sub-commander, a veteran of 12 previous campaigns, sent a private message to a colleague. "They do not retreat when they should. They do not break when broken. I hit the same unit 3 times, and each time they pulled back just far enough to let me advance, and then they hit me from the sides again. I am fighting soldiers who seem to enjoy this. I do not understand it, and they are smiling." The colleague read the message and did not know what to say. On the Concord ring, the Meath diplomat, the old gray one who had watched Alara Voss in the corridor and sent the quiet message home, received a private briefing from his government's intelligence service. It included a summary of the Orin's Gate engagement, sourced from 3 independent observers. He read it carefully. He read the casualty estimates on both sides. He looked at the timeline. 3 weeks, a world that should have fallen in 3 days. He sent another message home. It said, "Increase the priority of this situation. Humanity is holding. I do not think this will be a short conflict, and I am becoming increasingly uncertain about which side will determine its ending." In a medical bay on a human cruiser, 2 systems away from Orin's Gate, a young soldier named Private Don Osei was sitting up in a recovery bed with his left arm in a printed bone cast and a bandage across his ribs. He had been pulled out of the Orin's Gate tunnels 4 days ago. He was 22 years old and had grown up on a farming settlement on one of the mid-range colonies, a quiet place where the biggest excitement of any given week was a machinery breakdown or an unusually large harvest. A ship's counselor came to check on him, as counselors did when soldiers came back from hard engagements. She asked him how he was. She asked if he needed anything. She asked the careful questions that counselors were trained to ask to find out if someone was carrying something that needed to come out. Don thought about the tunnels, about the dark and the weight of rock above him, and the sound of Vorkai soldiers moving in the passages to the left, to the right, always somewhere close. About the moments of waiting that stretched so long his heartbeat had seemed very loud. About the moments of sudden, violent contact that were over so fast they almost didn't feel real until later. "I'm okay," he said. The counselor looked at him. She was good at her job, and she knew okay was a word that covered a lot of different territory. "Were you scared?" she asked. Don thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said. "Every day. But you kept going." He shrugged with his good shoulder. "Everybody did. That's what you do." He looked at the cast on his arm. They're still on that world, are eager to return to unit. She had seen this heals. The counselor wrote her notes. Stable, resolute, no signs of breakdown, eager to return to unit. She had seen this in most of the soldiers coming back from Orange Gate. Not recklessness, not numbness. Just a simple, clear, stubborn intention to continue. She had read enough about Vorkai warfare to know that this was not what their opponents usually looked like after 3 weeks of hard fighting. She filed her report and moved to the next bed. 6 months into the war, a Vorkai intelligence analyst, not Skath Var, a different one, younger and less careful with his words, submitted a report to high command that contained a line that got passed around quietly among the senior officers for weeks afterward. The line was not meant to be funny. It was meant to be a professional assessment, but it had a quality to it that people kept returning to. A record suggests they perform better, not records suggest they perform better, not worse, as conditions become more difficult. Current hypothesis: adverse conditions activate something in human soldiers that functions like enhanced motivation rather than reduced capability. We have no framework for this. Washa was happening on Orange Gate, and in the Horsha was happening on Orange Gate, and in the Cathara corridor, and at 3 relay stations and a fuel depot was simply to take more notes. Skethvar read the report. She appreciated the younger analyst's honesty, even if he did not fully understand what he was describing. She added a note to the bottom of her copy. On the note said, "There is nothing to study. This is simply who they are. The question is not what makes them fight this way. The question is how we end a war against a species that fights this way, and I do not yet have a good answer." She saved the note. She did not send it up the chain. Some things were better said when you also had a solution to offer. She went back to her data and kept looking. The first space battle that ended in a stalemate happened in the Reth system. 7 months after the declaration of war. It was not a famous battle. It was not particularly large. 2 Vorkai cruisers and their escort fighters engaged 3 human destroyers and a cruiser in a straight fight. No asteroids, no mines, no tricks. Just ships shooting at each other in open space. The Vorkai ships were bigger, better armed individually, more experienced in fleet combat. The human ships were faster. Their targeting systems were newer. Though their damage control was extraordinary. 3 times during the engagement, Vorkai fire hit human ships hard enough that any other species' vessels would have been dead in space. And all 3 times the human crews patched and rerouted and kept fighting. One destroyer took a hit to its primary drive, and its crew switched to secondary drive and attack profile in under 40 seconds. The Vorkai commander watching it happen had to check his sensors because he thought they were misreading. At the end of 4 hours, both sides withdrew. Both sides had taken significant damage. Nobody had won. The Vorkai commander filed his report. In the section marked Outcome, he wrote, "Inconclusive." Then he stared at that word for a long time. In 600 years of Vorkai military history, there was no record of a human equivalent outcome. There were victories, and there were cases where a stronger opponent had forced retreat. There was no such thing as inconclusive, because the Vorkai did not fight to a draw. They fought until the other side stopped. He sent the report. He included a personal note to Vrak Dan that was not part of the official record. The note said, "I believe we need to reassess our assumptions about this conflict. I say this with respect and with the understanding that I may be wrong. But I fought those ships today and they did not fight like they should. They fought like they expected to win. I am not certain anymore that they are wrong." Vrak Dan received the note. He read it late at night, alone in his command quarters, with the star field of his home system visible through the viewport. He thought about Skethvar's report. He thought about Orange Gate. He thought about the Cathara corridor and the mines and the 11 weeks of disrupted supply lines. He thought about 600 years of his species being the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. He thought about what it would mean if that was no longer entirely true. He did not sleep well that night. On a human staging base, Fleet Commander Solus was planning her 6th operation. She had a new set of maps spread across the table and a cup of cold coffee she kept forgetting to drink. Across the table from her, her tactical officer was running probability models on the next set of targets. "They're going to change their response pattern," her tactical officer said. "After the Reth engagement and the corridor mess, they'll figure out we're not going for big fleet battles." "Good," Solus said. Her tactical officer looked up. "Good? Let them figure it out. She pointed to the map. Every time they change their pattern to deal with what we did, they have to move resources. Moving resources creates gaps. Gaps are where we work. She picked up her cold coffee, remembered it was cold, set it down again. We don't need them to not understand us. We just need them to always be responding to what we did instead of what we're about to do. Her tactical officer looked at the maps and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Commander, do you think we can actually win this?" Solis looked at the maps. She thought about Orin's Gate and the soldiers in the tunnels. She thought about Don Osei and the 40,000 people at Halo Point who had said we're in. She thought about the shipyards running day and night. Arankun, the production numbers that were climbing every month, the new weapon systems coming out of development that were not yet deployed. She thought about Alara Voss straightening her jacket in the assembly. "Yes," she said, "but it's going to take a while, and it's going to be hard." She finally picked up the cold coffee and drank it. Good thing we're patient. She bent back over the maps. Outside the viewport of the staging base, 3 new human destroyers were running their first system checks, fresh from the construction yards. Their hulls were still clean. That would not last long. There were 600 years of unbroken Vorkai victories on one side of this war. On the other side, there were the maps and the mines and the tunnels, and the soldiers who smiled, and the shipyards that never turned their lights off. The galaxy was watching. Most of it was still afraid to say which way it thought this would go, but the watching was no longer casual. The war was 1 year old when the rest of the galaxy finally admitted it was paying attention. Not openly, not yet. The Vorkai still had 6,000 warships and a reputation built on 6 centuries of unbroken victories, and no species in the Concord was willing to say out loud what many of them were beginning to think privately. But the conversations were happening, in quiet chambers, in encrypted messages, and in the careful way that diplomats talk when they are feeling something out without wanting to commit to it. The thing they were feeling out was simple. Was it possible that humanity was not going to lose this war? A year ago, the answer had seemed obvious. Of course, humanity would lose. They were small and new, and the Vorkai were the Vorkai. It would be over in months. The only interesting question had been how badly humanity would be humiliated before they surrendered, and how long it would take them to recover. Now the question was less obvious. The Cathara corridor was still running at half capacity. The fuel depot in Sector 9 had not been rebuilt. Every time the Vorkai sent construction crews, something happened to delay the project. Orin's Gate was still in human hands. The mountains were still fortified. The Vorkai ground forces had pulled back to the lowlands and were holding a line they had not been able to push past in 4 months of trying. And 3 Vorkai relay stations had been destroyed. Supply lines across the outer territories were running slow and expensive, and humanity's fleet was larger now than it had been at the start of the war. That last point was the one that made the quiet conversations happen. Every species with any knowledge of military logistics understood what it meant. Normally, after a year of fighting, a smaller force's fleet shrank. Ships got destroyed, damaged, decommissioned. Replacing them took time. And the smaller side got smaller. That was how wars worked. Humanity's fleet had grown by 30% in 12 months. 30%, while fighting a war against the Vorkai. The old Meath diplomat, his name was Counselor Thirak, though most of his colleagues had taken to simply calling him the Old One, sat in his section of the Concord Ring and received a daily intelligence summary from his government. He had been reading these summaries for 60 years. He had a good sense of what mattered and what did not. What mattered this week was a production report from Earth that his government's analysts had managed to piece together from trade data and shipping manifests and the kind of careful observation that good intelligence services perform quietly and without announcement. The report said that human military production had increased by 42% since the declaration of war. Thirak read that number 3 times. Then he put the report down and looked out his viewport at the stars for a while. 42% increase, while managing supply lines for 42 colony worlds, while training new soldiers, while fighting active engagements in multiple sectors simultaneously, while repairing damaged ships and building new ones. He thought about the old Earth history he had reviewed years ago. He thought about the numbers he had seen then. The 1,000% production increases in old Earth conflicts, 8 of the factories built in bombed cities, the ships launched in impossible timelines. He thought, they are not even at full speed yet. That thought sat in him like a cold stone for the rest of the day. The species that had been conquered by the Vorkai were called, in the polite language of conquered diplomacy, associated members. It was a careful phrase. It did not say subjects, it did not say occupied. It said associated, tougher, as though the relationship between a Vorkai-controlled world and its controllers was a matter of mutual choice and shared interest. Everyone knew what it actually meant. There were 11 species with associated member status in the Conquered. Each of them had a delegation that attended sessions and voted on matters and participated in the formal rituals of galactic governance. Each of those delegations voted consistently in ways that did not upset the Vorkai. They had learned, or through painful experience across the decades and centuries, that upsetting the Vorkai had consequences. The species called the Thalek had been associated members for 140 years. They were a small, quick-moving people, bipedal, with wide dark eyes and four-fingered hands that were extraordinarily precise in their movements. They had once been known across the galaxy for their engineering and their art. Under Vorkai control, their engineering work went almost entirely toward Vorkai military projects, and their art had become quieter and more private, something practiced behind closed doors rather than shared openly. The Thelek delegate to the Concord was named Sarah Alm. She was middle-aged by her species standards, serious and careful, and she had held her position for 12 years by being exactly as unobtrusive as the Vorkai expected her to be. She voted the right way, she said the right things. She drew no attention. 8 months into the war, she received an unofficial message. It did not come through any Concord channel. It came through a private courier, delivered physically by a human trade representative who happened to be passing through the section of the ring where she kept her small office. The trade representative simply set a data chip on her desk, said nothing, and left. She looked at the data chip for a long time before picking it up. It said, Counselor Sarah Allen, I imagine. It said, Counselor Sarah Allen, I imagine you have been watching what is happening. I imagine you have been watching for a long time, and I imagine you are tired. I am not writing to ask you for anything right now. I am writing to tell you that we see you. We know what the Thelek were before, and we know what you have been living through. Yeah, when this is over, and it will be over, we would like to sit with you and talk about what comes next, not as a larger species talking down to a smaller one, as people who believe that what happened to you should not have happened and should not happen again. You do not need to respond to this, but if you want to, I am here. Sarah Allen read the message 4 times. Then she put the data chip in her desk drawer and locked it and went back to her work. But something had shifted in her. Something small and quiet that had been pressed flat for a very long time. She could feel it, like a seed in cold ground, beginning very slowly to consider the possibility of light. She was not the only one who received such a message. In the months that followed, every associated member species in the Concord received something similar. Not identical, each one shaped for the species it was written to. Each one careful and honest and asking for nothing immediately. One Alara Voss had written them all personally. Some of her staff had tried to suggest form letters, standard language, something more efficient. She had refused. These are people who have been told they don't matter for a very long time, she said. They deserve sentences that were written for them. On Earth, the second year of the war began with 2 things happening at the same time. The first was a new class of warship rolling out of the construction yards, faster than anything humanity had previously built, with a weapon system that the engineers had been developing in secret for 18 months. They were called Javelin-class destroyers, and the first 6 of them were assigned to Fleet Commander Solus, who looked at them with the expression of someone who has been given exactly the right tool for a job they have been thinking about for a long time. As the second thing was a classified briefing delivered to General Okafor by his intelligence service. The briefing concerned a Vorkai plan. The plan was simple and brutal. It had been developed, the intelligence suggested, by Vrak Don himself in response to the stalemate on Orange Gate and the continued disruption of supply lines. The Vorkai had decided to stop trying to win the conventional war and instead attempt to break humanity's will to fight. They were going to bomb colony worlds. Not military targets, not fortified positions, civilian settlements. The plan called for overwhelming orbital strikes on 3 outer colony worlds that had limited defensive capability. The intention was not to hold these worlds. The intention was to destroy them publicly, visibly, as a message to the rest of human space. This is what continuing this war costs you. Stop now, and it stops. Okafor read the briefing and felt something cold and steady move through him. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. The feeling of a person who has looked at something very bad and decided what they are going to do about it. He convened his council. He increased defensive assets around the most vulnerable colonies. He moved ships. He made what preparations he could. It was not enough. The Vorkai moved faster than the intelligence had suggested they would. 3 weeks after the briefing, they struck. The colony of Pharaoh's Landing was a quiet world of 12 million people. Most of them were farmers and traders. The colony was 30 years old. It had a small defense force and 2 orbital platforms. The Vorkai fleet that arrived above it numbered 40 ships. The 2 platforms fought for 20 minutes before being destroyed. Then the Vorkai began their bombardment. The news reached Earth in 6 hours. There are moments in history that do not work the way those who create them intend. The bombing of Pharaoh's Landing was meant to frighten humanity into surrender. And it was meant to show the cost of continuing to resist. It was meant to make ordinary people look at the price of the war and decide it was too high. It did none of those things. What it did instead was take every human being in every part of human space and remove any ambiguity they might have had about what this war was for and who the Vorkai truly were. The debates that had existed in some quarters about whether the war was worth the cost, whether a diplomatic solution was still possible, and whether Ilara Voss had perhaps acted too firmly in the assembly that day, those debates stopped. They stopped completely. Military enlistment, which had already been high, doubled in the week after Pharaoh's Landing. The colonial governments that had been managing their contributions to the war effort at a steady level increased their commitments across the board. The production acceleration that had already been running fast ran faster. When workers in the shipyards above Earth's moon were voluntarily extending their shifts. Not because they were ordered to, because they wanted to. And in human space, in the colonies and the stations and on Earth itself, people who had never met each other and would never meet each other found themselves feeling the same thing at the same time. It was not despair. It was not grief, though there was grief in it. It was the specific, hardened feeling of a people who have been shown something genuinely terrible and have decided with total clarity that it will be answered. General Okafor did not sleep the night the news came in. He sat in his office and read the casualty reports and looked at the images that were coming through the news channels and felt the weight of each name. He was not a person who showed emotion easily in professional settings, but that night alone, he allowed himself to feel what he felt. Then, way in the morning, he went back to work. Ambassador Ilara Voss was in a session of the Concord Assembly when the news came through. A staff member slipped her a data tablet with the initial reports. She read them under the table, keeping her face still and her posture straight, and did not react visibly in the chamber. When the session broke for its midday recess, she went to a small room off the main corridor and stood there alone for 3 minutes. She looked at the wall. She breathed carefully. She let herself feel what needed to be felt. Then she came out of the room and asked her communications staff to prepare a broadcast, not just to the Concord, a galaxy-wide broadcast on every open channel, every public frequency, every platform that would carry it. Every species will see this, she asked. Every species with access to Concord communications infrastructure, her communications officer said. That's essentially all of them. Good, she said. Why, let's go. The broadcast was recorded in the small human delegation chamber on the ring. There was nothing elaborate about it. Ilara stood in front of a plain background in her standard diplomatic clothing, and she spoke directly into the camera. She did not use notes. She began by describing Pharaoh's Landing, not with statistics, with specifics. The kind of colony it was, the kind of people who lived there, what their days had looked like before the Vorkai fleet arrived above their sky. Well, she spoke about it the way a person speaks about something real, not the way a diplomat speaks about an incident. Then she said, to every species watching this, Every world, every government, every person sitting wherever you are in this galaxy right now. I want to be honest with you. Humanity is in a war we did not start. We are in this war because we refuse to accept that any species has the right to look at another and say, "You are less than us. You are prey. Who you do not count." She paused. The Vorkai bombed a civilian world today because they wanted us to be afraid. I want them to know, and I want every species in this galaxy to witness me saying it, that it has not made us afraid. It has made us certain, more certain than we have ever been about anything. She looked directly at the camera. But I am not only speaking to the Vorkai right now, I am speaking to every species that has ever been told they don't count, and every world that has been living quietly under someone else's authority, voting carefully so as not to cause trouble, keeping their heads down and their voices low. I see you. Humanity sees you. We know what that costs. We know what it takes to keep living that way day after day. Her voice was steady and clear. We are not fighting this war for revenge. We are not fighting it for territory or resources or to replace one kind of dominance with another. We are fighting it because we believe, because we know, in the oldest and most honest part of who we are, that no species in this galaxy should ever have to live the way the Vorkai have made others live. And when this war is over, we are going to work every day for as long as it takes to make sure that is true. She let that settle for a moment. Stand with us if you can. Stand aside if you must. But know this, we are not stopping, not for threats, not for bombing, not for anything. Watch, the Vorkai have made their choice. We have made ours. She thanked the camera operator and walked out of the room. The broadcast was seen by every species in the Concorde within 36 hours of its transmission. The responses varied enormously. Several larger species issued official statements of neutrality that were notably warmer in tone than their previous positions. Or two smaller species sent private messages to the human delegation expressing support they were not yet ready to make public. The Vorkai issued a formal condemnation of the broadcast as inflammatory and destabilizing, which was noted and largely ignored. And six species, six within 1 week of the broadcast, sent formal messages to the human delegation requesting a meeting. Not public meetings, private ones, quiet ones. The kind of meetings that happen before the bigger meetings. Where people feel out whether trust is possible before committing to anything visible. 3 of those 6 were associated member species. Sarah Allen of the Thalek was one of them. She arrived at the meeting with 2 of her senior staff and a data package that represented 18 months of careful, secret preparation. Information about Vorkai military positions, supply schedules, fleet movements, system vulnerabilities. Things a species living under occupation learns by necessity, because when you are occupied, information about your occupiers is the only power you have. She set the data package on the table in front of Alara Voss and said, in a quiet, steady voice, "We have been waiting for someone to make this worth the risk. I think you might be that someone." Alara looked at the data package. She looked at Sarah Allen. She said, "Tell me about your people, not the military information. That can wait. Tell me who the Thalek are." Sarah Allen was quiet for a moment. Her wide, dark eyes held something complicated, something that had been pressed down for a long time and was not yet sure it was safe to rise. Then she started talking, and for the first time in 140 years, a Thalek delegate spoke freely about her people without calculating first whether the words would be safe. The coalition that formed over the following 3 months was not a military alliance in the traditional sense. It was not announced publicly. There were no grand ceremonies or signed treaties. It was a web of quiet agreements and shared information and carefully coordinated actions, built between humanity and 6 other species, 3 of which were technically still under Vorkai authority. What it provided was not immediately overwhelming military force. What it provided was intelligence, vast, detailed, precise intelligence about the Vorkai's systems and supply lines and fleet positions. Gathered by species who had lived alongside the Vorkai for generations and knew their patterns the way a person knows the habits of someone they have lived with for too long. Fleet Commander Solis received her first coalition intelligence package 3 weeks after the Thalek meeting and spent 2 full days reading through it with her tactical team. When she emerged from the briefing room, She looked like someone who had just been handed a map in the middle of a forest she had been navigating blind. "They've been watching the Vorkai for 100 years, she said to her second in command. "They know where every supply depot is. They know the patrol schedules. They know which commanders are careful and which ones are lazy. They know everything." Her second in command said, "How does that change our plan?" Solis thought about the Javelin destroyers sitting in her fleet, clean and fast and armed with systems the Vorkai had not yet seen in action. She thought about the intelligence package, the map in the forest. She thought about Orin's gate and the soldiers still in the tunnels, and Pharaoh's landing and the people who were gone. "It doesn't change the plan," she said. "It makes the plan possible." She went back to her maps. Somewhere in the galaxy, Vrakdon was reading his own reports about the broadcasts, about the quiet meetings, about the movement of human ships that his intelligence service had picked up but not fully decoded. He was beginning to understand that the shape of this war had changed in a way he had not anticipated and could not easily reverse. He was not sleeping well. Skethvar, in her small office surrounded by data, was writing a new report. This one was not urgent. It was something else, something longer and more careful, in on an attempt to put into words a conclusion she had been building toward for over a year. The conclusion was this: the Vorkai had not started a war with a small, young, fragile species. They had started a war with a species that had spent its entire existence being underestimated and had learned across thousands of years of complicated and painful history exactly what to do with that. She wrote the conclusion. She looked at it for a long time. Then she wrote one more line underneath it. When the line said, "I do not think this ends the way we believed it would." She saved the document. She sat in the quiet of her office and listened to the hum of the station around her, the constant background sound of a civilization going about its business, not yet understanding how much was about to change. Outside her viewport, the stars were the same as they had always been, steady and cold and vast. But the galaxy they held was different now. It just didn't know it yet. And the third year of the war began differently from the first two. In the first year, humanity had been reactive, learning the shape of the conflict, finding its edges, probing for weaknesses, building the infrastructure of a long war while fighting one at the same time. In the second year, humanity had been adaptive, using what it had learned, hitting harder, forming the quiet coalition, surviving the terror of Pharaoh's landing, and coming out the other side harder and more certain than before. When in the third year, humanity went on offense, it did not happen all at once. There was no single dramatic moment where the tide visibly turned. It happened the way most real and important things happen, gradually, then suddenly in 100 small places at the same time, until the overall picture was undeniable. Fleet Commander Solis led the first major offensive operation with her Javelin destroyers in the fourth week of the third year. What the target was a Vorkai military station called Reach Point 7, a large, heavily armed installation sitting at the junction of three major supply routes in the mid-territory. It was not a glamorous target. It was a practical one. Reach Point 7 was the hub through which roughly a third of the Vorkai's outer territory logistics moved. Destroying it would not end the war, but it would force the Vorkai to reroute enormous amounts of traffic through longer, slower, less efficient paths, and those paths had already been seeded, quietly, carefully over the previous 4 months, with the kind of attentive preparation that humanity had become very good at. The intelligence package from the Thelek and the other coalition species had told Solis exactly which approach vectors were least covered, exactly when the station's patrol rotations created gaps, exactly where the station's power systems were housed and how they connected. She used all of it. The operation lasted 9 hours. Then by the end of it, Reach Point 7 was debris. Human losses were 2 ships damaged and 1 destroyed. Vorkai losses were the station, its full complement of defending ships, and 3 months of supply route efficiency across their entire outer territory. Solis filed her report, got 4 hours of sleep, and started planning the next one. Vrakdon received the news about Reach Point 7 in his command quarters and did not move for a long time after reading it. He was not a person who panicked. He had been in command too long and seen too much to panic easily. But he was also not a person who lied to himself. And the honest part of him knew that the loss of Reach Point 7 was not just a military setback. It was a signal. It was humanity telling him, clearly and without ambiguity, that the shape of the war had changed. They were no longer just surviving, they were advancing. He called an emergency session of his high command. The faces around the table were less confident than they had been 2 years ago. The easy certainty of the early months, "Prey does not negotiate, this will be over quickly," was gone. What remained was the harder, more complicated thing that experienced military commanders are left with when a conflict does not go the way it was supposed to. The need to reassess honestly, without pride getting in the way. Skethvar was at the table. She had been at every high command session for the last 18 months. She spoke less than anyone else there, and was listened to more carefully than almost anyone else there, because she had been right about humanity from the beginning, and everyone in that room knew it. Vrakdon looked at her. "Give me your assessment." She had been thinking about her assessment for weeks. She had written 3 different versions of it and discarded 2 because they were either too blunt or not blunt enough. More ships, more soldiers, more ships, more soldiers, more established territory. On paper, we remain the larger force. She paused. But humanity has achieved something that no opponent has ever achieved against us in 600 years. They have made the war expensive enough, long enough, and uncertain enough that continuing it carries a cost our empire cannot sustain indefinitely. Their fleet grows while ours repairs. Their coalition provides intelligence we cannot fully counter. Their soldiers fight in ways that make our ground advantages smaller with every engagement. The room was very quiet. "And there is something else," she said. "The galaxy is watching. The associated species are watching. Every world that has lived under our authority is watching humanity hold this line and asking themselves a question they have not dared ask in generations. The longer this war continues without a decisive Vorkai victory, the louder that question gets." "What question?" one of the commanders asked, though the way he asked it suggested he already knew. "Whether we are actually as invincible as we have always appeared to be," Skethvar said. The room absorbed that in silence. When Vrakdon said, "You are recommending we seek terms." "I am recommending," Skethvar said carefully, "that we do not wait until we have no choice. Because if we wait until we have no choice, humanity will have no reason to offer us favorable ones." They did not seek terms. Not then. Vrakdon was not ready. The instinct of 600 years of unbroken victory was not a small thing to overcome. He ordered a new campaign instead. A major push into human mid-territory, with the largest Vorkai fleet mobilization of the entire war. Over 400 ships assembled across 3 staging points, intended as the decisive blow that should have happened in the first year and had been delayed too long. It was called, in the Vorkai's internal communications, Operation Final Shape. The name was meant to convey certainty. This would define the final shape of the conflict on Vorkai terms. Humanity learned about it from Sarah Allen's intelligence network 3 weeks before it launched. General Okafor read the intelligence and spent 2 days working through every option with his council. The Vorkai fleet was large, larger than anything humanity had faced directly so far. A straight engagement was still not advisable, even with 3 years of production growth behind them. But retreating was not acceptable either. Retreating ceded territory and morale, and showed the coalition partners that humanity could be pushed back when the Vorkai pushed hard enough. The solution they arrived at was not simple. It required perfect coordination between human fleet elements across 3 different sectors, precise timing, and the willing participation of 2 coalition partners who would be risking a great deal by acting openly against the Vorkai for the first time. Okafor called Sarah Allen personally. He explained what was needed. He told her exactly what the risk was and did not minimize it. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "We have been waiting 140 years for a moment worth risking everything for. Tell me what you need." Operation Final Shape launched on a Tuesday, as far as the human calendar was concerned. 412 Vorkai warships moved in 3 coordinated columns toward human mid-territory, fast and massive and prepared for the decisive engagement their commanders had been promising for 2 years. They found in the first system they entered that the human ships they had been tracking were gone, not destroyed, gone. The positions they had been monitoring, the fleet concentrations their scouts had mapped, all of it had moved in the previous 72 hours. The system was empty. The Vorkai columns pressed forward. This happened sometimes. Opponents repositioned before a large engagement. They would find the human fleet. The human fleet could not hide forever from 400 ships. What they found instead, as they pressed deeper into the second system, was that their rear was under attack. Solus had taken her Javelin group and the two fastest elements of the main human fleet and gone around. Not through the systems the Vorkai were advancing through, around them, sure, through a longer route that the Thelic intelligence had identified as unmonitored. While the Vorkai columns moved forward looking for a human fleet to destroy, human ships were hitting their supply lines, their communication relays, their staging points, destroying the infrastructure that 400 ships depended on to operate at full capacity. The Vorkai columns stopped advancing to deal with the threat to their rear. When they turned, they found that the human ships were already gone, hitting something else, somewhere else, always moving, never where the Vorkai expected them to be. And then, while the Vorkai fleet was stopped and turned and confused and their communications were running through damaged relays, the full human fleet and their coalition partners hit the lead column from three sides simultaneously. It was not a clean victory. Human losses were significant. 11 ships destroyed, 23 damaged. Thousands of crew members killed in the hardest fighting of the entire war. Okafor read every name afterward. He always did. The fighting lasted 4 days across 2 star systems, and there were moments in those 4 days when the outcome was genuinely unclear. But when it was over, the lead column of the Vorkai fleet was destroyed. The other 2 columns, their communications compromised and their supply lines disrupted and their lead column gone, made the decision to fall back. When Operation Final Shape had failed, the news traveled through the galaxy faster than any official communication. Species that had been carefully neutral began making less careful statements. Associated member worlds that had been silent started asking quiet questions of their Vorkai administrators that had never been asked before. The Vorkai's internal communications, several of which were now being monitored by coalition intelligence, showed something that Skethvar had been predicting for months: a fracturing of the absolute certainty that had held Vorkai military culture together for 6 centuries. Soldiers who had never questioned their invincibility were questioning it now. Officers who had never considered that a war against a smaller species might be lost were considering it. And in the associated member worlds, in the quiet places where people had learned to keep their true thoughts to themselves, and something was shifting, not visibly yet, not publicly, but the questions were being asked that, once asked, could not be unasked. Vrakdon received the full casualty report from the Final Shape engagement and read it alone in his command quarters at 3 in the morning, ship time. He read it the way a person reads something they already knew was going to be bad but hoped would be less bad than they feared. It was not less bad. He set the report down. He looked at the stars outside his viewport. He thought about his brother Vrak-San, sitting comfortably in the Concord Assembly 2 years ago, crushing a communications terminal and laughing. He thought about how easy it had seemed, how small humanity had looked, how certain everything had been. He thought about Skethvar's words at the high command table. If we wait until we have no choice, humanity will have no reason to offer us favorable ones. He sat with that thought for a long time, and then he picked up his communicator and sent a message to Skethvar. The message said, "Prepare a diplomatic framework, exploratory only, no commitments. I want to understand what terms might be possible." Skethvar received the message at 5 in the morning, was awake and reading it within seconds, and spent the next hour sitting very still and feeling something she did not often allow herself to feel. Relief. Deep, quiet, complicated relief. The peace talks did not happen quickly. Nothing about this war had happened quickly, and the talks were no different. There were preliminary contacts through the Concord's neutral mediation service. There were back-channel communications between Skethvar and a human diplomatic team that Alara Voss led personally. There were several points at which the talks nearly collapsed. A Vorkai commander launched an unauthorized strike on a human convoy 3 weeks into the preliminary phase, and Okafor had to make the decision not to respond in kind because a response would have ended the talks, and he believed the talks were real. It was one of the hardest decisions he made in the entire war. Ilara was in the third month of preliminary talks when she received a message from General Okafor explaining what he had decided about the convoy attack and why. She read it and thought, "This is a good man." She sent him a message back that said, "I agree with your decision. Keep holding." They kept holding. The formal talks began on the Concord Ring in a neutral chamber that had been prepared with atmospheric conditions suitable for both species. It was the first time Alara Voss and Vrak Don had been in the same room. He was larger than she had expected, though she had known his dimensions from intelligence files. There was something about the physical reality of a Vorkai in person that data could not fully prepare you for. The sheer presence of a creature that had been, biologically and militarily, the most dangerous thing in the galaxy for as long as anyone could remember. She looked at him without flinching. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, because Vorkai faces were different from human ones, but she thought she detected something in it that she had not expected to see. Tiredness. Old, deep tiredness. The talks lasted 11 days. The Vorkai negotiators pushed on every point, as was expected. When they were good at negotiation, they had been doing it from a position of total power for centuries, which meant they were very good at extracting favorable terms. What they discovered was that Ilara Voss and her team were not going to be extracted from. Humanity's terms were three, and they were firm. Full withdrawal from all conquered systems. Every species the Vorkai had occupied, for however long, in however many systems, free. Governance returned to the people who lived there. Cut recognition of every species' sovereignty. A formal, binding, Concord-registered commitment that no species would use military force to subjugate another. Not suggestions, not guidelines. Commitments with defined consequences. A seat at the Concord for every species that had been denied one. The associated members, all 11 of them, would become full members, with full voting rights immediately. The Vorkai negotiators spent 2 days trying to reduce these terms. They offered variations, exemptions, phased timelines, complicated language that would have meant less in practice than it sounded. Ilara listened to all of it with the patience she had been practicing for her entire career. Then she said each time, in slightly different words but with the same meaning, "No." On the 9th day, Vrak Don himself came to the table. He had been present at the talks but had let his negotiators lead. On the 9th day, he sat directly across from Ilara and looked at her and said, "You understand that what you are asking us to give up represents centuries of our history." "Yes," Ilara said, "I understand that." "And you will not reduce the terms?" "No," she said, "I will not." He was quiet for a moment. "Why not? You have won enough to ask for less and still call it victory. Why these specific terms? Why the occupied worlds? Why the Concord seats?" Ilara looked at him. She thought about Pharaoh's Landing. She thought about Sarah On's voice when she had finally spoken freely about her people. She thought about the soldier Don Osi sitting in a medical bay with a broken arm saying everybody kept going. That's just what you do. She thought about the unanimous vote. Because winning a war and fixing what caused the war are two different things, she said. We could take territory from you. We could demand tribute. We could humiliate you the way your brother humiliated my delegation, and call it justice. But none of that changes the fact that 11 species are living under occupation right now, and 100 more are living in a galaxy where that is possible, where the strongest species can simply take what they want and call the people they take it from prey. She leaned forward slightly. We are not fighting for ourselves. We never were. We are fighting because the galaxy you built is wrong, and we want to help build a better one. These terms are how we begin. Vrak Don looked at her for a long time. On the 11th day, he signed. The signing was not public. That came later in a formal Concord session that the entire galaxy could watch. But the moment of signing was quiet. A small room, a few witnesses, a document that would take years to fully implement, but whose existence changed everything. Afterward, as the room was clearing, Vrak Don approached Ilara. His negotiators were behind him. Her team was behind her. But he walked toward her as though he wanted a moment without the weight of both teams listening, and she waited because she understood what he needed. He stopped in front of her. He was much taller. She looked up at him without any particular expression. Not triumph, not coldness, just presence. He said in a voice low enough that only she could clearly hear, "Why did you not destroy us? You could have. And after the final shape engagement, you had the momentum. Your coalition was growing. Another year, perhaps two, and you could have taken our home system and ended us entirely." His golden eyes were steady on hers. "Why did you not?" Ilara was quiet for a moment. She had known this question was coming. She had known it since the preliminary talks, when she had understood that Vrakdan was a serious person who would eventually ask the serious question. "Hey, because we have already seen what happens when the powerful exterminate the defeated," she said. "We wrote entire history books about it. What it does to the ones who are lost, and what it does to the ones who do it. We are not here to rule the galaxy." She paused. "We are here to make sure nobody has to live the way your species made others live." Vrakdan was very still. She extended her hand toward him. The human gesture, palm open, waiting. He looked at it. He knew what it meant. He had read about it, the way he had read about many human things in the last 3 years, trying to understand what he was dealing with. "Don't make us regret it," she said quietly. He looked at her hand for one more moment. Then he reached out and took it. His hand was enormous around hers. The grip was careful. She held it steadily. The formal Concord session happened 3 weeks later. The chamber was fuller than it had ever been. Every associated species was present. ITRA and several species that had previously sent only observer delegations had sent full representatives. The gallery above the main floor was packed. On 100 worlds across the galaxy, the broadcast was being watched by billions of people, in methane atmospheres and oxygen ones, in cold and heat and low gravity and high. Sarah Allen sat in the Thelek delegation's new section, not the cramped outer position they had occupied as an associated member, but a full seat, a properly sized and properly placed, equal among equals. She sat very straight and very still, and her wide dark eyes were bright with something she had not allowed herself to feel in public for a very long time. The human delegation section had a new terminal, clean and whole and undamaged. Ilara Voss walked to the speaker's platform at the center of the chamber. She looked around the room, at the faces of 323 species, at the gallery full of observers, or at the cameras sending the image across the galaxy. She thought about standing at the same platform 3 years ago, 2 sentences into prepared remarks that never got finished. She thought about the quiet before her, and the destruction of the terminal, and the weight of all those silent delegations watching and saying nothing because they were afraid. She thought about how different the silence was now. 3 years ago, she said, a delegate in this chamber called humanity prey. He meant it as an ending, a statement of what we were and what we would remain. She paused. "I want to thank him for it." There was a murmur through the chamber, not quite laughter, something warmer. "Not because it didn't hurt," she said. "It did, but because it made something very clear to us and to everyone watching. It showed us, without ambiguity, what we were fighting and why. And it showed every species in this galaxy exactly what kind of universe we were all living in." She looked slowly around the room. "That universe is over. Not perfectly. Nothing is ever perfect. There is a great deal of work still to do. 11 species are returning to self-governance after years or decades or more than a century of occupation. And that process will be difficult and will need help and will not be finished quickly. The Concord itself needs rebuilding in ways that make what happened here 3 years ago impossible to repeat. These are real tasks, and they will take real time and real commitment from every species in this chamber." She stopped for a moment, and when she continued, her voice was a little quieter. Not for effect, but because the next thing she had to say was genuinely true, and she wanted it to sound that way. "But today, right now, in this moment, every species in this gallery has a seat at this table. Every voice counts. Nobody in this room is prey." The chamber was silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then it was not silent at all. Private Don Osei watched the broadcast from a rehabilitation facility on a mid-range colony where he had been for the past 4 months, recovering from injuries he had taken in the final shape engagement. His left arm was fully healed now. 3 ribs were still knitting, and he was expected to return to active duty in 6 weeks. He watched Ilara Voss at the speaker's platform and listened to the chamber respond and felt something move through him that he did not have a precise word for. It was not quite joy. It was not quite relief. It was something that lived in the space between those two things. The feeling of a long, hard effort finally arriving at the place it was always pointing toward. He thought about the tunnels on Oran's Gate. He thought about the dark and the rock and the weight and the sounds of the Vorkai and the passages nearby. He thought about his unit, the people he had fought beside, some of whom were not here anymore. He thought about all of them, and he hoped in whatever way felt right that they could somehow know how it had ended. On the screen, the Concord chamber was still alive with sound. Species that had been quiet for generations were not quiet anymore. Oh, the camera moved across the faces. Different faces, in different shapes and colors and sizes, breathing different air, seeing with different eyes, and all of them were present. All of them were real. Don looked at the screen for a long time. Then he turned off the broadcast and picked up his recovery exercise equipment and got back to work. There was still a war's worth of healing to do, for him and for a great many others. But they would get there. In her small office on the Concord Ring, Skethvar sat alone and read through the session notes from the formal signing. She had not attended in person. She was no longer officially in her post, having resigned from Vorkai Intelligence Service 2 months earlier, a decision that had been complicated and quiet and was not yet fully resolved in her own mind. She did not know yet what came next for her. She had spent her career in service of a system that had just fundamentally changed. The work she had done, the reports, and the assessments, the honest warnings that had mostly gone unheeded until it was almost too late, it had been real work, done carefully and with good intent, and some of it had mattered. She believed that, but she also knew that intention and outcome were not always the same thing, and she had a great deal of thinking to do about the gap between them. She pulled up the last report she had ever filed in her official capacity, in the one that had ended with, "I do not think this ends the way we believed it would." She read that line. Then she opened a new document and wrote a new line below it. It read, "It ended better." She saved the document. She sat back in her chair and looked at the stars outside her viewport. The same stars she had always looked at. The same vast, cold, steady field of light that had been there before any of this and would be there long after. The galaxy was the same galaxy it had always been. For same stars, same distances, same deep and patient silence between the worlds. But what lived in it was different now. What was possible in it was different. What the creatures who moved between those stars believed about themselves and about each other, that was different. It was not finished. It would never be fully finished. There would be problems and failures and moments when the progress seemed fragile and the old ways seemed to be pulling back. That was the nature of things. Sorta, that was the nature of any species and maybe of any galaxy. But the direction had changed. And direction, Skethvar had always believed, was what mattered most. The historians would spend decades writing about it. The analyses would come in waves. Immediate ones full of incomplete information and big emotions. Then careful academic ones full of data and distance. Then the longer and stranger ones that tried to understand not just what happened, but what it meant. The most widely read account, published 7 years after the Concord signing, ended with a paragraph that became something people quoted, not because it was the most accurate or the most detailed, but because it said something true in a way that felt right. It said the galaxy had feared many things across its long history, supernovae and black holes, the silence between stars that sometimes meant nothing and sometimes meant something was coming. The Vorkai, for 600 years, it had been near the top of that list. A species so powerful and so certain of its own dominance that entire civilizations had rearranged themselves around the fact of that dominance, quietly over generations, until the rearranging felt like the natural order of things. And then a soft, short-lived, physically unremarkable species from a single pale blue dot looked up from a speaker's platform in the Concord Assembly, straightened its jacket, Winnonen decided that the natural order of things was going to change. It took 3 years. It cost a great deal. The people who paid that cost deserve to be remembered by name, and in the fuller accounts, they are. But what they built in those 3 years, the thing that outlasted the fighting and the fear and the long nights in the shipyards and the tunnels and the small rooms where messages were written for people who had never been written to before, that thing was simple. They built a galaxy where nobody had to be prey. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.